I am not a Spillit veteran. This is my first time. So. Thank you all the friendly faces in the crowd. I appreciate that. I'm going to start out with a bold claim. Oh, cliffhanger. It's not really that bold. School starts way too early. And I'm not talking about 8:15 a.m. elementary schools. I'm talking about 7:15 in the morning high school. Where are you at, high school teachers? That stuff is just unnatural. That's an unnatural consequence. Stay on the script. And it was, you go to school so early, and a few years ago, school started at 7 a.m. And I had kids in my classroom at 6:45 in the morning, right? I had just left my car looking at stars in the sky, walking into school. It's just too early. But it was on one of those early mornings when a student taught me something a few years ago. And she taught me an important lesson about what kind of critical engagement we as educators and as the institution of school ought to be fostering between students and the world around them. And she reminded me, as a history teacher, about the civic aim of education. So it's the morning announcements during homeroom. Teacher reflection number 1. Most of our stories are set in really ordinary spaces, right? Your classroom, the hallway on transition, lunch duty, a basketball gym, all these places. And so it's hard to communicate the level of meaning that's happening in those spaces to your friends who aren't in the building with you. Right? Do you ever find your stories not making sense to people who aren't also teachers? You tell a story like, yeah, this girl said this to this guy, and he said this, and then I said this to both of them. And they're like, that's an interesting story. You really got those 12-year-olds. Great. And it's because it's such an ordinary interaction, but there's so many social interactions happening in a day, which is why we're always so exhausted at the end of the day. That there's so much meaning happening in those ordinary spaces. And I'll contend tonight that it's in those ordinary spaces that we're actually the most formed. So it's homeroom. It's a week into school. It's early August, and kids are just trickling into my senior homeroom, mostly asleep, sitting quietly in their desks as 18-year-olds do at 7:15 in the morning. And all their excitement is just gone, right? It's a weekend. They were happy last week. They're seeing their friends, finding out whose classes they're going to take, but now it's just gone. Like they're exhausted somehow, and they just don't really want to be there already a weekend. And then morning announcements come on. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And so I stand up, and I say, all right, y'all, you can go ahead and stand up with me. And I see, these seniors throwing their bodies out of their seats, trying to stand up while they're still asleep. And almost everybody stands up, but one girl doesn't. Teacher reflection number 2. Didn't my teacher prep program teach me that I have to set really high expectations in that first week or the whole year is lost, right? Like, if I don't set those, we're done for. And so for me, that's going through my head, right? And that's every teacher prep program, to be honest. You're always taught that in some way you have to have routines and procedures and expectations and structure. And those are good things, right? No one's going to deny those are good things. But so my homeroom, having them stand for the pledge and stand for the moment of silence or whatever is more about setting an expectation like, hey, even in a class you don't get a grade in, like we're going to still do what we got to do. It's just 15 minutes. And the veteran educators out there know that you really got to have structure at homeroom because that's where report cards come out. And on report card day, if you don't have a structure, it gets wild in there. I don't know. In my first couple of years, it was kids coming to me demanding, like, how did you give me this low grade? And I'm like, explaining, I don't give you, just make up a grade, trying to break all this stuff down. Or the classic, when you give a kid a U in conduct and an F for a grade, hit him with the teacher FU. It's always contentious. So it can get wild, and so you have to have structure. Y'all gotta know that joke by now. Come on. That has been around Shelby County Schools. So you gotta have structure. So my eyes meet this girl's eyes as she stays in her seat during the pledge. And I can feel the tension in me of my authority being challenged in the room. And I wonder if everyone else is looking at me, my other students, So I give her a teacher look meant to communicate, like, you gonna stand up? And she looks at me from across the room, and she shakes her head and just mouths, I can't. So this girl was one of my best students the year before in Honors U.S. History. She engaged deeply with the material and personally. She asked questions of herself, of her country, of democracy, what this whole thing's about. She processed the double consciousness she feels of being both Black and American. And she did so while being kind and thoughtful and hardworking. Like the student you just think of that makes you want to just cry because you love that kid so much. And so I'm wondering what's going on. What is she thinking about? So she's processing all of her identity. And so all these things are going through my head, right? I'm thinking about my teacher training. I'm thinking about who this girl is and her processing of her identity, her development. I'm thinking about the historical moment we're in. And all this happens in 5 seconds in real time, right? Teachers have to process things lightning fast. All this stuff went through my head in a matter of 5 seconds, probably. And that's another reason we're so exhausted and just don't want to think about anything and go home. But all this is on my mind, but especially the historical moment we're in. Okay, so this is August 2017. And August 2017 has been about a year in the national narrative in the media. We're seeing actually stories about Colin Kaepernick resurfacing because it's a new NFL season and he's still being blacklisted for protesting police brutality by taking a knee during the national anthem. And so, as we process complicated aspects of our identity and our country, we often do so in a clunky way. And teenagers are no exception, right? So as I saw my students process this, even in an all-Black setting, they're making jokes about Kaepernick and, I'm going to sit during the pledge and this and that. But eventually most of them would kind of get a rise out of kids and stand, right? So that's in my mind. I'm like, I wonder if this is part of that. Is she serious? What's going on? But more immediately and more importantly, this is a Monday morning, and the weekend before had been the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. You see white men walking at night holding torches chanting, "You will not replace us." And the next day, a counter-protester named Heather Heyer was hit by a car, driven by one of those men and killed. And then the president comes on and says there are very fine people on both sides of the story here. Right? And as teachers, you always just got to go to work. No matter what happened the night before or hours before, you got to go to work. And some days you have the energy and you work yourself up like, okay, I'm going to process it myself. I'm going to make sure I'm ready to talk through this with my kids, make sure they feel safe, this kind of stuff. And some days you just hope nobody asks about it, And so when she told me no, that she wasn't going to stand or she couldn't stand, I went and I sat in the desk next to her. And I waited a little bit for the announcements to hit a lull. And I asked, what's keeping you from standing up? And she started just saying, I hate, and stopped herself. She took a breath, calmed herself down and said, I just can't. And so we just sat there for a second. I could see as I got closer to her, she was just flooded with emotion. And you can tell in that statement she was feeling something deeply. And so we let the announcements end. And I tell her, when I say the pledge, I say it more as like a hope or a prayer that we would actually live up to the creeds we claim as a country, that there would be liberty and justice for all. She said, yeah, I was thinking about that, like a good U.S. history student. And she said, but things just don't seem to be headed that way right now. Things just don't seem to be headed that way. So teacher reflection number 3. The lesson, and the final reflection, for those who keep in time. The lesson she taught me that day was that some of the most harmful instances of school discipline happen when we are too focused on ourselves as teachers. And she showed me that I was a little too focused on how I was being perceived by my other students in the classroom. And that I wasn't focused enough on her and what she might be processing. And see, as teachers, we have all these opportunities to escalate conflict. And I've done that plenty of times. But we also have an opportunity to be gracious to students who are working out who they are in public. Like, we get out of high school, we kind of make fun of like how fake that felt, and like, wow, that was terrible, you know? And you get in the real world now. Now, for them, that is the real world, right? Society for them is their peers in history class or in their homeroom. And this girl wasn't being disengaged by saying no to me. She was being especially engaged with her identity and who she is and who our country is, what our country is. And so I think that when we talk about restorative justice, the first step we have to take is for us as educators and adults, even if you're not an educator. And it's of doing your own emotional work. And we have to ask ourselves questions about our identities, right? You can only lead someone somewhere if you've gone there yourself. We have so much of these kids that we don't do ourselves when it comes to our emotional work. Because what is it about us that sets us off when a kid says no to us? Why are we that insecure? You follow me? What makes me so afraid that I'm going to be looking like I'm little or powerless? Where's my identity? Where does my power come from? And so I think as educators, we must do that work to begin talking about restorative justice. Because when we pay attention to ourselves and our emotional status, the hurt we felt, the pain we've lived through, that is when we can begin paying attention to how formative schools are. There's spaces where folks are working out their identities in public, and that's when you feel the most self-conscious and vulnerable and in need of grace offered by someone else. And so I hope as we talk about this, we think of ways we can make school space for people to be figuring out who they are and not just punished into compliance for it. Right? In high poverty schools, we talk about compliance like it's the ultimate behavior. And I hope that we can make schools where students can learn what it is to seek justice, even when, and especially when, things just don't seem to be headed that way right now. Thank you.